appropriate descriptor for this book. This has been energizing for me. It really has, to go back through the book, to relate to the experiences and to connect it to new things that I've learned. So I'm grateful to you all for participating so that I had the opportunity to do this. And we read in 3 parts, and I told you all to read part 5 in the epilogue, but the part that I meant when I was thinking epilogue that I wanted to ensure that you read was the afterword. So hopefully you all read that, since the book sort of inevitably takes us there anyways. But if you didn't, it's very brief. You can read it tonight after we finish. But it adds just one final wrinkle to the saga that David and Nick and the Sheff family are experiencing. So where I wanted to start in part 5 is during a period of time where Nick is doing well. He's left a treatment center and he's happy. And he's riding bikes. He's going on these long bike rides with his sponsor, Randy. And he's really in a healthy place where he's feeling connected and he's healthy in his recovery. And he says on page 238, "I love my life." And that's, again, a pretty insignificant quote in one sense, but I thought it was significant because the very first time that I got to participate in any kind of research, I did my master's thesis on people in recovery. And I did this fancy kind of study called a phenomenology. And what that tries to do is get at the essential experience of something. So not to try to define it, but to get at what is it like? So what is it like to be in recovery? What is that, being in recovery? And what was interesting is in the interviews that I did with people in long-term recovery, contentment was the theme that came out. I interviewed people in various forms of recovery. Some people were abstinent, some people drank alcohol, some people used medications, but all of them were experiencing an improved quality of life. And that's for them what their recovery was, that contentment. And I thought it was interesting that Nick alluded to that. And then David has a subarachnoid hematoma. I won't pretend to know what that is. I know it's a bad medical emergency, but the reason I point it out is because David writes about how Nick is there to support him. And I can relate to that experience just when you've been the person who so many people are supporting for so long, and you can start to feel like a burden and carry some guilt associated with that. It's really a relief for the tables to be turned for once, and to finally be in a position where you're able to support a person that you love. It's a pretty cool experience that Nick gets to have in recovery. But unfortunately, there's no storybook ending to this story of addiction and many stories of addiction. And David wanted to end the book with the letter that Nick wrote to Jasper. And and that really would have been a perfect book end. If you remember that at the beginning of the book, David parachutes us right into the middle of Nick's relationship with his siblings. And what he's trying to do is really humanize their lives and say, hey, these are people who have dreams and ambitions and who love each other. And there are good things here and happy things here. And Nick's letter to Jasper, where he wanted to end the book, was a letter where Nick was making amends and explaining to the best of his ability what he'd been through and what he wanted to do going forward. And it's almost fitting that he can't, because that's the nature of addiction and a chronic disease, is sometimes it rears its ugly head. And I'll tell you all that I started my academic career, my undergraduate career, for one semester as an English lit major. And I learned very quickly that I am an academic writer and not an English lit writer. I got a horrible grade, the worst grade I've ever gotten in a class. I won't even tell you what I got, don't ask. And I did remember some things from that experience though. And one of the things I remembered is the literary technique of contrast, of taking two things that are diametrically opposed and setting them against each other for effect. And that's what David's doing with these accounts of Nick's addiction that are so graphic and poignant. And then he sets them against these really pedestrian and normal and kind of ho-hum accounts of Jasper and Daisy just being kids. And in many ways, that's how families experience addiction, because it's reality interrupted by this surreal addiction experience. And so Nick relapses after almost 2 years of doing really well and steadily improving. And the way that I read it, this is just my kind of interpretation, is that one seemed to really be a gut punch for David. And I think family members, here tonight might be able to identify with that experience, that even though all relapses are tragic in a sense, there are certain ones that just seem to hurt a little worse, maybe because we were in a place where we were more hopeful, or because we were in a place where we were more vulnerable. But nevertheless, David seems hurt by that. And he contemplates on whether or not to tell Jasper and Daisy, and also what to tell them. And I thought that's an interesting question that he posed to us. And if we had more time for more breakouts, it's one that I considered asking of you all. To what extent should we include kids in that conversation? And since we don't have the time to have that breakout, I'll offer my thoughts quickly. And that is, it seems that what we tell kids is important, but what we let them tell us is more important. And what I mean by that is the real concern when you have young children who are impacted by their sibling or their parent or their relative's addiction, the real concern is the trauma that they're experiencing, whether that's primary or secondary trauma, and providing a space for them to process that, to ask questions, to be where they are, but also to make sense of what's happening in their world is really important. And to David's credit, he gets Jasper and Daisy involved in family therapy. And I really commend him for that. I think oftentimes many of us are guilty of well, two things. One, saying that kids are too young to be impacted by addiction. Oftentimes I'll hear something to that effect, that, oh, well, they're not old enough to really remember what happened. And it's definitely not true that young kids are not impacted. In many ways, young kids are more impacted because they're less equipped to cope. And it's also true, sometimes people will say, it's not true, but sometimes people will say that young children are too young for therapy. And that's also not true. There are a variety of therapeutic techniques that have been designed specifically to build rapport with young children and to help resolve their needs. And so it's really important that David gave Jasper and Daisy that opportunity. And I think you saw that in therapy when the therapist provided that space and they had a lot of questions. And it kind of caught David off guard because he thought he had done, to the best of his ability, a pretty good job of providing that space. And then I wanted to just commend to you all two resources. If you have teenagers who are impacted by their loved one's addiction, Alateen is another companion program to AA related to Al-Anon, but oriented toward teenagers. And sometimes they're hard to find if you live particularly in rural communities. But if you live in urban areas, like I know Lexington, for instance, has a really robust recovery community and has access to those things. And then lastly, one of my undergraduate students last semester introduced me to a book that's really, really cool. It's called Critters Cry Too by Anthony Curcio. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but it's a children's book that helps kids make sense of addiction. And I think it's a really sensitive and appropriate book for young children. So I'd commend that to you all as well. And so relapse happens and relapse happens and relapse happens. And Nick says, I think this is a quote from Dumbledore from Harry Potter. He says, numbing the pain for a while will make it worse once you finally feel it. And I think that's absolutely true. It's true of my experience and a lot of people's experience that binging makes the physical withdrawals worse, but also the psychological impact of being addicted over time much more severe. And on page 257, David writes, the descent is quick. Nick shows up high at work. He loses his job. His phone's disconnected because he doesn't pay his bill. He deserts every real friend, and saddest, he's deserted his best friend and sponsor, Randy. And we alluded to this, I think, in our last book club session, that it may take someone 5 or 10 years to become addicted to a drug, but once they've become addicted and those changes have occurred in the brain, after each brief period of sobriety, the descent into a relapse is quicker and quicker. And then I also wanted to mention what these relapse experiences are like for David. And David writes that it's like watching from afar, perhaps from binoculars with broken lenses, the moment before a train wreck. And sometimes I think the phrase a train wreck is kind of a cliche. It's trite because we overuse it. But I want to point out something important about that analogy. Trains travel on tracks, which means you see the inevitability of the wreck, right? That's what a train wreck is. So being a parent of a loved one who's addicted is you're watching the inevitability of the pain and the suffering that's going to come when you see this relapse happening. And I think that's a really appropriate analogy. And later on, David writes, parents of addicts learn to temper hope even as we never completely lose hope. However, we are terrified of optimism, terrified that it will be punished. And that breaks my heart for him that he's having that experience. But I think it's absolutely true that you're afraid, that you're always guarding your optimism. And so I mentioned at the very end of our last session that I have a graduate student who's going to be doing a study with me where we're going to be asking family members of addicted loved ones, in their view, what's the difference between enabling and supporting. And so I'm not collecting data. We're not, recording this for that purpose or anything like that. But in some ways, this is kind of an interesting pilot. I wonder what your all's experiences are and how you understand the difference between enabling your loved one in addiction, which we think is a bad thing, versus supporting them, which inevitably is a good thing. So take 10 minutes and I'll see you on the other side. The rest of this middle section talking about rock bottom, because I think it's related to enabling and supporting, and it's something that's not been clearly defined. And yet, when it comes to addiction, it tends to be the only story that most of us understand about addiction. And so David, I love this quote because David sort of seems to have reached a conclusion, and then at the very end, he walks it back. So he says, I wait for Nick to hit some sort of bottom. It sinks in after everything we've been through and everything we've read and heard. Addicts ultimately recover when they hit bottom. They become desperate and hopeless and terrified, and they must become so hopeless, desperate, and terrified that they're willing to do anything to save their lives. He seems convicted, but then he says, but how could Nick have not been hitting bottom? Like, after all the miserable things that their family has experienced, how could that not be a sufficient bottom? And so then he includes a really interesting quote from Dr. Richard Rawson. And I'll be honest with you all, I'm not familiar with him, or I wasn't before rereading this book, but I like him because I totally agree with what he says here. He says hitting bottom is a tautology. And if you're not familiar with that word, it's a really cool concept. It basically means a truism, something that's necessarily true. So it's two ways of saying the same thing. And here's how Dr. Rawson explains it. He says, when a person finally gets sober and remains sober for a period of time, the bad stuff that happened to them immediately prior is referred to as hitting bottom. Similar periods of awfulness that are equally awful, but that don't lead to sobriety are, by definition, not hitting bottom. And then some people die before they hit bottom. So I don't think bottom is a helpful construct. And I'll be honest with you all that I'm inclined to agree with Dr. Rawson. That, I think when we wrote about the concept of rock bottom, that was in the 1930s in AA when we were talking about alcoholism. But today we're in the midst of an opioid overdose crisis where so many of my friends are dying. 100,000 people in the last calendar year. It's just an extraordinary number of people. And for all those 100,000 individuals, rock bottom for them was dying. It was not getting an opportunity to recover. And I think for that reason, rock bottom is not entirely helpful. And also because it's a tautology. It's necessarily true that whatever bad thing happened to you before you got sober is a bottom, but it doesn't mean that it's the thing that caused you to become sober. For so many of my friends, they experienced awful things, and it wasn't the worst things that they experienced that prompted them to get well. So I think rock bottom, it's much more complicated, I guess I would say, than we lead people to believe. And so somewhat unfairly, I'm going to send you into a breakout to consider the question that I've just offered my own opinion on. And I considered doing it the other way around. But again, you should know that there isn't a clear answer here. And so I wanted you to know kind of what my thoughts are. But I also am really hopeful that there's someone bold enough and honest enough and willing enough to express, both in the breakout and afterwards, a different view, a different understanding of rock bottom. So take 10 minutes and I'll see you on the other side. What did you think? Did you all have some thoughts on rock bottom? Is it necessary to hit rock bottom?
I would like to share from my own personal experience. I'm 3 years and 6 months sober from alcohol. And yay, I'm so happy. But I believe I hit rock bottom. I was one of those functional people that drank, and nobody really realized how much I was drinking. And I tried to hide a lot of it. But I got so drunk once that, and I mixed it with some pills, unfortunately, that I blacked out, and I don't recall several days. And in that time frame, my husband took me to the emergency room, and the emergency room doctors admitted me to a treatment center. And so my rock bottom was when I sort of kind of came to and realized where I was and that I could not leave that place on my own free will. In fact, I couldn't even go to the bathroom on my own free will. And I thought, never in my life did I ever think I would be in a place like this. I don't belong here. I don't have a problem. I was in denial. And there's nothing wrong with me. Let me out of here. I don't have a problem. I just like a glass of wine in the evening. What are you talking about? And I was in there with other people that were real addicts. You know, I didn't belong there. But through counseling and everything else, and she said, well, do you remember yesterday? Do you remember the day before yesterday? Do you remember the day before that? Do you remember going to the emergency room? Do you remember this? Do you remember that? No, I don't remember any of it. And that's when it hit me. And it scared the living daylights out of me. It scared me straight. I'm really going to say it scared me straight, because I never had a drop of alcohol since then. Thank God. So I do believe in being like at your rock bottom, because that was my rock bottom. But I think a rock bottom is different for everybody.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience, Barbara. First of all, congratulations on your recovery. That's meaningful. And second of all, yeah, I think so many of us have stories that fit exactly the trajectory of yours. And in so many ways, mine does too. I ended up homeless under a bridge, addicted to heroin. That's the bad thing that happened to me right before I got sober. So I think in many ways, it would be fair to call that a rock bottom. But I also look at so many of my friends who went to the same place and they didn't recover in that experience. And so for them, rock bottom wasn't what led to recovery. Or I knew people who recovered when they experienced much more minor consequences. My first sponsor in a 12-step program, this is kind of a funny story. I didn't intend to tell this, but I'll tell it quickly. My first sponsor in a 12-step program, the consequence that looked like bottom for him was losing a volunteer position. He was volunteering in the Peace Corps, and his alcoholism reared its ugly head, and he got kicked out of the Peace Corps, which is a little bit comical in some sense, getting fired from a volunteer job. But also, I think it's pretty minor in the grand scheme of what bottom looks like. So if nothing else, it complicates that. So thank you to Barbara for offering that. So as we move in here, I wanted to offer some thoughts on treatment. And I think this is Dr. Richard Rawson's quotes about the treatment apparatus. And I think they're very apropos. He says, making a selection of programs in the mental health or substance abuse treatment system is like reading tea leaves, right? It's like, there's really not a science to it. There's not a regulatory system that certifies treatment centers effectively to tell you what's good treatment, what's bad treatment. It's really a challenge for family members to try to discern. We don't make family members of loved ones who have cancer do the same thing when they're seeking cancer treatment. We know what to recommend and what's evidence-based. We really don't for addiction. And later on, he says it's a non-system comprised of rumor, marketing, BS, best guesses, and opportunism. And I think that's also well said. It's opportunistic in the sense that capitalism comes between families and they're suffering. And many times there are people out there who are looking to take advantage of families in a stressed and vulnerable position, whether that's making them overpay for treatment or taking advantage of their loved ones in sober living, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an unfortunate reality. On page 295, when Nick returns to rehab, David writes, Nick is safe in rehab, but I remain skeptical. And for some reason, this little nugget just hurt my heart a little bit, because I thought about Nick and I thought about how much he's probably suffering while he's in rehab, because I remember how much I suffered. We talked about last time, anhedonia, that inability to experience pleasure when you're really early in recovery. And I know that Nick is in a miserable place and he's doing the hardest work of his life. And it just makes me sad that his family has to be skeptical. And I don't say that to be critical of David. David's only being honest about how he feels, and he feels skeptical, and that's honest, and that's okay. But it makes me sad for Nick that everyone's skeptical despite his very best efforts. And later on, David's conflicted and he says, I'm here to see Nick, but I'm also afraid, and I don't want to see him, and I don't want to be happy to see him. And he's almost disappointed in himself for being elated to see his son. And maybe some family members here can identify with that mix of emotions of you don't want to show your child your joy at seeing them because you don't want them to think that you're condoning what they're doing or or that you're happy with where they are. And yet you are overjoyed to see them and to see that they're well. And there's another experience, again, that I identify with. David goes to Family Week and scoffs at art therapy. And then Nick begins doing his drawing and he's writing, "I'm sorry," all over the page as hard as he can with the crayon. And at first David's wondering, is he being manipulative? Is he trying to pull one over on me? And eventually it becomes really clear to David that Nick is just suffering and he's experiencing guilt and shame and he's sorry. And I've had that experience of thinking that art therapy was a silly thing and then having it strike me as a little heavier later on. He says, "It's easy to forget that no matter how hard it is for us, it's even harder for him." And I know that there are family members who would disagree with that. I've heard many a family member say, "Well, at least my loved one gets to get high. I don't get to get high. 24 hours a day, I live with the pain of their addiction." And I understand that. Even though I haven't experienced it, I know what that means. But I have experienced anhedonia. I know what it's like not to be able to get pleasure no matter what you do. And that's a kind of misery that I'm not sure that everyone can relate to. So I just appreciated David maybe acknowledging that. And I can't remember who gave us this comment earlier on, but after our first breakout, someone talked about how David's perspective changed. There was an evolution in David's approach. And I'm so grateful that you mentioned that, because that's exactly where I'm going. And I wanted to leave you all with a little bit of a picture of what ends up working for David. And I want to be clear that this is not prescriptive in saying this is what you should do or need to do, because I think it varies in context, it varies by family, but this is what David found that worked for him. First, this is Dr. Rawson writing to David, and it becomes David's adopted approach. "All my support would be linked to their entry to treatment." So when Nick is in a place where he's struggling, where he's in his active addiction, this is how David understands the difference between enabling and support. All of his support is contingent on Nick getting back into a healthy place. And that makes sense to me. And David's approach is meaningful, not just for Nick, but it's meaningful for David himself, because it frees him from the responsibility, from those 3 C's of having to control and feel responsible for causing it or curing it. David's taking care of David in the healthiest of ways. And I think that's what family members have to do. And this is really interesting to me. So the top paragraph here, I wrote by myself as I was just prepping, and I hadn't gotten to page 310 yet. And then I read the quote that David wrote that I think is another way of saying the exact same thing, at least the way that I read it. So I just thought that was interesting. So first, this is what I wrote, is then once you've linked all your support to treatment and your loved one has agreed to go and they've gone and done the work, then it's about forging boundaries to protect how much addiction can affect your life. So that way you can still be involved. It's not about trying to block your loved one out. And sometimes boundaries feel that way because they feel like walls, but they're not. They're walls that have gates. They're semi-permeable, right? And so that way you can still be involved and you can still be connected to the person you love and you can still advocate for them. And you don't have to let them just suffer on their own, but you don't have to let it destroy you at the same time. You get to live your life. And those are my words. And then on page 310, David writes, "Rather than codependent and enabling with me trying to control him, even to save him, our relationship can evolve into one of independence, acceptance, and compassion with healthy boundaries, and the love is a given." And I like that he's written this because I think it stands up to an important litmus test, which is, could this apply when your loved one is both in active addiction and in a healthy place in recovery? And to me, the answer is yes. Is whether they're using or whether they're in a safe place, in a healthy place, you can always have a relationship that's predicated on independence, acceptance, compassion with healthy boundaries, and where love is a given. And so I'm going to send you into our third breakout to ask you to consider what you took from the book. And this could be anything and everything, big and small. What are you going to take with you from Beautiful Boy and from the kind of glimpse that David gave us into his experience? But I do want to ask you to come back on the other side because I want to hear you reflect on that. And then I have one more thing I want to mention from the afterward that I want to share with you. So take 10 minutes. See you on the other side. Okay, what did you learn? What did you learn from the Big Blue Book Club, from Beautiful Boy, from David's family, from their experiences? What will you take with you?
I learned that David is a very strong person, and he never stopped loving Nick in spite of everything. And it was a very difficult read, and it was very real. And he spoke from the heart. And that I know it had to be hard, extremely hard, to never give up on Nick. And he just kept loving him. And that's one of the things that we emphasize in our Celebrate Recovery program at our church, is that love the person, hate the addiction, hate the product. So that's one thing I take from the book.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for being here, Barbara. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Did anybody else want to share what they're going to take with them?
I think something I took from it in the whole book was, he started out like most of us do, you know, oh, I'm so proud of my son. I'm so proud of my child. I have this wonderful child. And it just kind of emphasized, you never really know when your whole situation's going to turn upside down, and what you thought you had planned out for the future falls completely apart, and you just have to learn to try to do the best you can. You'll sit there and wonder, why am I in this situation? What did I do so wrong to have this happen to me? But you grow and you learn and you do the best you can, and you hope to come out the other side successfully.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, and thanks for being here. I think you're right. That's so much of what David gave us here is a glimpse into the side of addiction that we don't normally see. You don't see it in the movies, the typical media portrayals of addiction that are so graphic and focused on just singularly on the drug use. You really see David working through it and struggling with something that he didn't get an instruction manual for. And I think that is something that a lot of family members have experienced. How about one more person? One more person.
I like that the therapist told him, he talked about how much stress every time the phone rang, he was afraid it was Nick on, he's relapsed again. And the therapist just told him to turn the phone off and talk to Nick about, we'll talk once a week and that's all. And other times of the day and night, just set a few hours where you just turn the phone totally off. It never rings. So you never have that heart-wrenching, oh my gosh, it's Nick again. And I think that our families use the cell phones way too much. I think that children's cell phones need to be turned off except for an hour a day. I think our children are being controlled by their cell phones. And we also, many of us, are being controlled by our cell phones. Having to check them every 15, 20 minutes is crazy. Just turn them off for 2 or 3 hours.
Yes, so you make two good points there. A good point about boundaries, which is that David learns, he evolves a new ability to cope and adapt. And that is, I want to shut off my phone so that I can spare my mental health, so I can be the best that I can be for my family, both my loved one who's addicted and for the remainder of my family. But also what you say about phones is true. There doesn't have to be a drug present for there to be an addiction, and phones are absolutely an addiction. So let me say this really clearly and unequivocally. The part of your brain that's impacted when you use heroin or you drink alcohol is the same part of your brain that's getting pleasure from playing with your phone. It's absolutely the same thing. And it's absolutely why when I sit in class, I watch my students grab for their phones every 15 seconds, phantom buzz, phantom buzz. It's absolutely the same reality. So it's time to wrap up, but I wanted to share with you one last thing, which is the first time I read this book, you know, you get to the end, the epilogue, and David is kind of doing that thing we do at the end of movies where they put words on the screen and they tell you where all the characters ended up and how everyone's future is happy. Nick is safe and healthy in the West, and Jasper and Daisy have grown up and the family's healthy and all is well. And then if you read the afterword, Nick relapses again. And I don't know if it was a shock for you, but it was a shock for me. The first time I read it, because I really was thinking, this is Nick's a published author by now. He's a successful speaker on the circuit. He's an important person in the recovery community. This can't happen. And it speaks to two things for me. One, again, the chronic nature of addiction, the fact that this is a long-term disorder and that relapse is often a part of it. And in my view, it provides more evidence that rock bottom isn't necessarily the answer, because when Nick relapses at the end of the book, he doesn't have to experience lots of consequences. He doesn't have to lose his job. He doesn't have to damage relationships. He doesn't have to get arrested. He makes a decision to return to treatment on his own. And I think that shows us that there is another way, that even if rock bottom is ultimately how some people recover, it may not be how everyone recovers. And so I wanted to finish just by sharing this with you. I'm speaking at the Harm Reduction Summit next month. And it reminded me that the last time I was at the Harm Reduction Summit presenting research was in 2019. And the keynote speaker that year was a young man named Austin Eubanks. And Austin Eubanks, I hope that I speak about him respectfully. Austin was a survivor of the Columbine shooting, the school shooting.
Oh, wow.
And Austin suffered some serious, physical wounds and also psychological wounds that ended up resulting in an addiction to opioids. And he got sober. And in his recovery, he became a really cool speaker. He went across the country and he spoke in schools, and he gave this incredible keynote at the Harm Reduction Summit about the connection between suffering and addiction. And I just remember being so in awe of him. He was wearing a really neatly tailored suit, and he had an attractive wife and a good looking family. And he was the COO of a treatment center. And I thought, he's got it all together. He's 10 years in recovery. And I was on vacation with my family a month later, and I saw on CNN on the bottom line on the ticker that Austin Eubanks overdosed and died in his home.
Oh my
10 years
God.
in recovery. And I think that for me was a watershed moment with addiction. That's when it clicked finally for me, that to some extent, when you have the disorder that we have, there's always going to be a vulnerability there. And for that reason, my takeaway from the book is kind of dark, but I think also realistic. And that is that addiction is suffering. And sometimes that's all that we can say. It's suffering for people who are addicted. It's suffering for family members. It's suffering for people in the community who are impacted. And because of that, the only thing that I know for certain is that what all of us need, family members and people who are addicted, is a little bit more grace and a little bit more judgment. And that may feel a little hokey or like a platitude, but I reflected on this genuinely, and that's where I came to. And so I hope that makes sense to you. And I'm grateful for all of you for spending time with me and for learning more about addiction and more about how family members are impacted. And I'm not sure what our next Big Blue Book Club is featuring. Mindy, do you want to tease that before we jump off of here?
I wish that I could, but we are still in negotiations with our next author. And so I can't reveal that yet. We did have a couple of questions. One is this book a movie? And Nick and David collaborated on a movie that is called Beautiful Boy, but it's actually both of their books together. And I do highly recommend it if you haven't watched it. I believe it is available on maybe Amazon Prime, or maybe it's on, I'm thinking.
Mandy, it's Amazon Prime.
It is Amazon Prime. Okay. Yeah. So I knew I'd watch it on something, but I couldn't remember which one it was. So that is, there was another question. Nick or Alex, has any other country had success in the addiction fight?
There are countries that are having more success than us that generally take a slightly different approach. One cool example that I'll share with you quickly is Iceland. They've had a lot more success in prevention. And so Cabrina knows this if she's still on, because I speak to her students at the teen conference about this sometimes. But in our country, we really predicate prevention on kind of scare tactics and just say no and try to keep kids off drugs that way. And in Iceland, what they decided to do instead was to really focus on giving kids opportunities to be connected and to be engaged and be involved, really giving them more positive opportunities rather than fewer negative opportunities, if that makes sense. So they created soccer fields and gymnastics arenas, and they gave every kid under the age of 18 these leisure cards, which are like little Dave and Buster's cards where they can go to an arcade or to a movie theater. And basically what it did is it expanded opportunities for kids to have alternatives to drugs, to do something more positive, more engaging, that gave them dopamine, that lets them get high on life instead of getting high on drugs. And it worked really well. So in 1998, 25% of their 15 and 16-year-olds had been drunk in the past 30 days. And 18 years later, in 2016, only 5% of their 15 and 16-year-olds had been drunk in the past 30 days. So it was incredibly, incredibly impactful. And one of the things it shows is that you can't just punish addiction or drug use out of people or to prevent addiction. Really what you have to do is make sure that it goes back to contentment for me, whether you're talking about prevention for a kid or recovery for someone who had been addicted. If you're not content, if your quality of life isn't better, then drugs become appealing all of a sudden. So just one example.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and watch from your local extension offices and from the Big Blue Book Club Facebook group for information about our next book. Hopefully it will be later in or sometime in the fall, October or November. And we thank you all for joining us. As always, y'all are always a great audience and a great crowd because you have great things to share with us. Alex, thanks for leading this session. You've, as always, contribute and moderate in such a great and meaningful way.
Thank you. And thank you, Mindy, for all your help. You make me look good.